I'm Joe Condon. Welcome to our program. This week we're going to be talking about head injuries, and we have with us to talk about that Dr. Donald Brady of Northeast Medical Center in Syracuse. Dr. Brady is a nationally recognized expert on brain injuries, concussions, head injuries. He has a PhD in clinical psychology. He's a licensed clinical psychologist in New York State, a nationally certified school psychologist, a licensed family and marriage therapist. What do you do in your spare time? Doctor, Doctor, so nice to have you with us.
Thanks for inviting me back, Joe. Appreciate it.
This is an interesting statistic. The incidence of sports-related concussions occurring in the United States is said to be about 300,000 a year.
Well, that study was done in the 1990s, I believe. That has been revised.
Upward or downward?
Oh, quite upward. They talk about anywhere from 1.6 to 3.8 million brain injuries that are occurring each year in recreation-related activities. And I think one of the things, whenever you look at any stats, it's kind of like grabbing smoke, because we know many of them go unreported. And that's part of the issue here, that people end up playing. There's still many people who believe you have to be knocked out if you had a concussion. And if you don't suffer a knockout, then you're okay. But the stats I've read, roughly only about 10% of the people get KO'd. The 90% of the people, they have some alternate change in their consciousness and brain functioning, and that's a concussion. And a better word to use, excuse me, that we're pushing for is using the term brain injury, because that's what happens.
A concussion is a brain injury.
Yes, correct.
Are parents of school children, players, and the general public more aware of the dangers of playing football than they were, say, just a few years ago?
I would say yes and no.
All right.
They are once it hits home. Once a child gets injured, they're more aware because they see it right in front of them. They see their son or daughter suffering various symptoms, whether they're cognitive, emotional, physical, and all of the above. What I have found, a good example, the other night I stopped for a bite to eat. I consult the nursing homes, and the reason I mention that, not only do I deal with the brain injury with the younger people, but I also deal with older people, Alzheimer, dementia. So I see the effects along the whole spectrum, and the ripple effect on families and the finances that it creates, especially if someone has to be placed in a nursing home. People don't understand how expensive it is. I know one of the nursing homes I consult to, it's $12,000 a month, and that's for a double room.
And you are dealing with patients in the nursing home that have suffered from head injuries?
Well, they're diagnosed with various types of dementia.
Okay.
Okay. And as a result of that, they have the cognitive difficulties, they have emotional difficulties, and they also have various physical difficulties. And along with the physical difficulties, I'm talking walking, hand-eye coordination, and their senses can be impaired. People don't realize that vision, hearing, smell, when your brain gets injured, that can be adversely affected. In fact, vision has been an incredibly neglected area. And one of the reasons that you have the trouble with the vision, in the front part here, typically somebody's running, they get whacked in the front, or but what happens, the brain is bouncing back and forth. The brain actually ricochets in the skull when you're being tackled. And the back part here is the occipital region. This is your vision region. So what happens? You get it bouncing in the front, bouncing in the back. Then people start talking about double vision, blurry vision. And it's not something that we can say, oh, let's go to the eye doctor, get a new prescription. It's a physical problem that they may have to live with for the rest of their life. And perhaps you may know someone who suffered a stroke. It's the same idea. If it hits this area, they can have these problems, and they could be permanent.
Concussions from sports, or brain injury from sports, are schools, colleges, and the NFL doing something to address these problems?
Well, that's like a multiple part answer.
Okay.
We'll start at the top. I think what we're seeing from organizations like the NFL, NCAA, USA Football, much of it is marketing, PR marketing. Terms like safer football, heads up, better equipment. These terms have been used for over 100 years. I can show you pull out some research, 1890 something. We want to make football safer. 1906, we want to make football safer. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to enforce the rules. We're going to make sure they tackle different. We're going to have them tackle with their heads up. I talked with a former NFL player, Dave Megacy, and he's well known up in the Syracuse area because he went to Syracuse. And he was saying, Don, I got my 2 worst concussions playing heads up football. And Dave played in the 60, 70 era. Mm-hmm. So this heads up football that they're marketing now is not new, but people don't know that. I think what the parents have to do, and this goes back to your question before, parents have to be learning about the history of football. And once you learn the history of football and this safer football and the better equipment, you see this has been said over and over again. I think partially these organizations are very worried that football is being attacked, and rightfully so, because it's a dangerous sport. And I argue when they say safer football, safe means free from harm. If you watch a football game, you'll see people be carried off. Each game, people get injured. And we're not only talking brain injury, but we're talking non-brain injury. And I think the history of the NFL and football is, well, injuries are part of the game. And I think that's why the concussion/brain injury has been more accepted, because it hasn't been critically evaluated. And there's sports sociologists will say, you know, there's a ton of different statistics. They keep coming out with a new statistic for whatever, for the players. But we're not critically evaluating what's going on. We talk about, oh, it creates physical health, but that's just lip service. I was just reading an article in 1998 from a doctor who said, we kind of have a moral right to start taking care of these people. We got to be educating people. This is a dangerous sport. And they talked about it being a dangerous sport in the early 1900s. So there's a lot of verbiage, rhetoric being used to give the illusion of helping, and I don't think it's going on. So then you add into the factor, people are getting bigger, quicker. It's a violent game. As one NFL player said, Don, it's a violent game. We're taught to beat up the opposing team. I mean, interesting choice of terms. Beat up. And I happened to be watching ESPN the other day, because one of the things I try to do is keep current with what's happening. And on 2 different times, one player mentioned and an announcer mentioned, wow, they really beat up the other team. So we have institutionalized violence that's sanctioned. And one of the amazing things, when I was doing my research, I found that a stationary receiver was hit by a NFL player, and they clocked it at 25 miles an hour. So if the receiver was ever running, say at a comparable rate, you'd have a 50-mile-an-hour crack up. And I've heard NFL players, linemen say, you know, I feel like I was in about 10 auto accidents during today's game. And I've seen research that says 10, 15 miles per hour can create a brain injury.
Well, you can see the dents it puts in a car going at a slow.
True.
One thing I've noticed this year, it seems to be, unfortunately, not unusual that you will see on a somewhat regular basis a story about a high school student who was playing football and they die in a game. Have you been noticing that too?
Yes, but it's not only this year. If you go into last year, they had comparable number of deaths. If you go through the whole football history, you see that. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt, when he was president, he called together colleges because of the violence, the injuries, and the number of deaths that were occurring. And realistically, there's a great researcher, Matt Cheney, and if people go on the internet, go to Four Walls Publishing, he has incredible history on how the brain injury were a focus in the 1890s and till now. But it's been ignored by certain people, and the NFL is trying, and NCAA, they try to call it safer football, and it's marketing. It's not science.
Well, speaking of safer football, they say that there are new helmets out which are making playing football safer. Are the new helmets effective, or
no? Is
it marketing?
It's marketing. As I said, your brain is bouncing around in your skull. Boom, 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 boom. And depending on how you hit, it can go sideways. You're not going to stop that. Think of an egg, okay? And you got the yolk. You may have that eggshell, okay, but if you're shaking that egg, the inside of the eggs, the yolk and the other part are going to be moving. Now, in a skull, you have some sharp parts. So then the brain can be sheared, and along with bruising. The bruising can cause swelling, and the shearing can cause bleeding. When the bleeding occurs, that kills that area of the brain.
Recently, it came out that Frank Gifford, who died at age 84, suffered from traumatic brain injury. Kathy Lee Gifford of the family donated his brain to medicine, hoping to bridge the gap between football and traumatic brain injuries. Are there any other famous football players who have suffered brain injuries that you can think of?
Yes. In fact, over in Boston, the last number I saw, 91 brains of players were looked at, and of which 87 had CTE. That's a pretty high percentage. And I know the naysayers try to say, well, that's selective. We haven't looked at everybody, so you're choosing a sample that may not be representative. Or these are single cases. You mentioned were there any other ones. Probably I would say who's got the most famous, who received a lot of recognition, was Junior Seau. He committed suicide.
Right, yeah.
And that seemed to hit another notch up as far as concern for concussions. And it also educated people to some degree that a brain injury is just not your cognitive. It's not your memory. It's not forgetting where your keys are, forgetting what day it is. It can impact your emotions. And take the combination of, okay, your brain's been impacted cognitively, you don't have impulse control, so you get an idea, you're upset, you follow through with it, one of which can be suicide. We have kids in the 20s who have been found to have CTE who played football and who killed themselves. And realistically, the number of deaths, and Matt Cheney has written very well on this, the number of deaths in football are underestimated because they can go down as something else. And one of the things people don't realize, if you get a concussion, you're more prone to a stroke. There was a relatively recent incident, was a teenage kid got hit in the neck, concussed, brain injury, ended up with a stroke.